keep it private, and then like if we want to, somebody misses and wants to listen or something, you know, it's kind of like having a book on tape, right? You know, reading. It's kind of like having a book on. Anyway, okay,
Yeah.
so let's jump in. Alrighty. All right, so we are Judaism's life-changing ideas. So in this week's Parsha, the actual Parsha is Parshat Vayigash. We're 2 weeks away from beginning the book of Exodus. But in this book, we're at a different pace. So we're beginning the book of Exodus, Rabbi Sachs's last book, Judaism's life-changing ideas. So let's jump in. This is page 65. Shmot. God loves those who argue. That is a very Jewish title. I have become increasingly concerned about the assault on free speech taking place throughout the West, particularly in university campuses. And he writes just in the footnote, I first wrote about this in my book, The Home We Build Together, in the chapter entitled The Defeat of Freedom in the Name of Freedom. And he says the situation has become significantly worse since then. Wow, and that was in 2007. This is being done in the name of safe space. That is, space in which you are protected against hearing views which might cause you distress, trigger warnings, and microaggressions, namely any remark that someone might find offensive, even if no offense is meant. So if any speech that you say that might be construed as offensive to somebody is inappropriate. So far has this gone at the beginning of the 2017 academic year. Students at an Oxford college banned the presence of representatives of the Christian Union on the grounds that some might find their presence alienating and offensive. Increasingly, speakers with controversial views are being disinvited. The number of such incidents on American college campuses rose from 6 in 2000 to 44 in 2016. Undoubtedly, this entire movement was undertaken for the highest of motives to protect the feelings of the vulnerable. That is a legitimate ethical concern. Jewish law goes to extremes in condemning lashon hara, hurtful or derogatory speech, and the sages were careful to use what they called lashon sagi nahor, euphemism, to avoid language that people might find offensive. So just for example, I'll just explain that concept that Rabbi Sachs uses. Sagi nahor literally means a lot of light, but it refers to somebody who's blind. So instead of calling somebody, hey, you're blind, which can cause a certain level of pain to a person, just being told that, even though they know that, we call them as they have like almost like amazing vision. You take it kind of to the opposite extreme. But a safe space is not one in which you silence dissenting views. And by the way, it's not said in a condescending way. It's said in almost a complimentary way. But a safe space is not one in which you silence dissenting views. To the contrary, it is one in which you give a respectful hearing to views opposed to your own, knowing that your views, too, will be listened to respectfully. That is academic freedom, and it is essential to a free society. So he just says in the footnote, number 5, I salute the University of Chicago, Princeton, and other universities that have taken a strong stance in defense of free speech on campus. And Professor Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues at the Heterodox academy founded to promote intellectual diversity in academic life. As George Orwell said, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And it's worth just reflecting in our own life, especially in the last 4 years and beyond, but it's gone to more of an extreme, is whether you feel safe expressing certain views to people. Are there people you can express views to? Are there places that you can express certain views? And why can't you? Why shouldn't you feel safe to express yourself? John, I think that's a reflection of this issue. John Stuart Mill likewise wrote that one of the worst offenses against freedom is to stigmatize those who hold a contrary opinion as bad and immoral men. That is happening today in institutions that are supposed to be the guardians of academic freedom. We are coming perilously close to what Julian Benda called in 1927 the treason of the intellectuals. He claimed that academic life had been degraded to the extent that it had allowed itself to become an arena for the intellectual organization of political hatreds. What is striking about Judaism, and we see this starkly in this Parsha, we're talking about Parshat Shmot, which is what we're reading, is that argument and the hearing of contrary views is of the essence of religious life. And he's very particular on his language. He's not saying that it's a nice idea. He's saying that it is the essence of religious life. Moses argued with God. That is one of the most striking things about him. He argues with him on their first encounter at the burning bush. 4 times he resists God's call to lead the Israelites to freedom until God finally gets angry with him. More significantly, at the end of the Parsha, he says to God, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why did you send me? Since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. This is an extraordinary language for a human being to use to God. But Moses was not the first to do so. The first was Abraham, who said, on hearing of God's plan to destroy the cities of the plain, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Similarly, Jeremiah, posing the age-old question of why bad things happen to good people and good things to bad people, asked, why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease? In the same vein, Habakkuk challenged God, why do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Job, who challenged God's justice, is vindicated in the book that bears his name, while his friends who defended divine justice are said to not have spoken correctly. Wow, that's very bad. I've never thought of that. Heaven, in short, is not a safe space in the current meaning of the phrase. To the contrary, God loves those who argue with him. So it seems from Tanakh. Equally striking is the fact that the sages continued the tradition and gave it a name, argument for the sake of heaven. In Hebrew, machloket l'shem shamayim, defined as debate for the sake of truth, as opposed to victory. Wow, when you debate for the sake of truth, it's really saying that I have a truth, and when you express yourself to me, I can become enhanced by your truth. I might disagree with it, but it might inform me in certain ways. It might even help me understand my own truth a little bit better by hearing your perspective. The result is that Judaism is perhaps uniquely a civilization of all of the whose canonical texts are anthologies of arguments. Midrash operates on the principle that there are 70 faces to Torah, and thus that every verse is open to multiple interpretations. The Mishnah is full of paragraphs in the form of Rabbi X says this, while Rabbi Y says that. The Talmud says in the name of God himself about the conflicting views of the schools of Hillel and Shammai, that these and those are the words of the living God. A standard edition of Mikrot Gdolot, which is a format of the Torah that it's a book and has many commentaries on every verse. It consists of the biblical text surrounded by multiple commentaries and even commentaries on this commentaries. The standard edition of the Babylonian Talmud has the text surrounded by the often conflicting views of Rashi and the Tosafists. Why do you need a commentary on a commentary? Because a commentary on a commentary tells you why the commentary was wrong or why they were right. So it's basically creating a whole dialogue on the page of conflicting views. Moses Maimonides, writing his masterpiece of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, took the almost unprecedented step of presenting only the halachic conclusion without the accompanying arguments. The ironic but predictable result was that the Mishnah Torah was eventually surrounded by an endless array of commentaries and arguments. In Judaism, there's something holy about argument. So just for instance, if you would open up Rabbi Maimonides' book, the Mishnah Torah, you would see about 6 different people all commenting on him. And often they disagree, and sometimes they agree. Now, remarkable about the Mishnah Torah, in his time when Maimonides wrote the Mishnah Torah, he was relatively young. The elder of the generation was his name is slipping my mind, but nevertheless, this rabbi, who was the sage of the generation, started to write comments on various sections of Maimonides, and typically he disagreed with him. Actually, he only really wrote a comment when he didn't agree with Maimonides. Now, on one hand, you might say, oh, this was against Maimonides. But in fact, the fact that a great rabbi is commenting on your material actually means that there's significance to your material. And that actually put Maimonides on a pedestal, even though sometimes when he comments on the Rambam, on Maimonides, he uses pretty harsh language because Maimonides is younger than him. But nevertheless, the fact that people argue with Maimonides was a sign of his greatness. Rashi, the primary commentator on the Torah and the Talmud. Why is Rashi Rashi? How did he become that? Because there were so many people who commented on him. It's almost like a process of peer review. So the more people you have kind of looking at you from different directions, sometimes they disagree, but oftentimes they're like, wow, you have a lot of value to say, then you become more elevated. Okay. So in Judaism, there's something holy, kadosh, about argument. Why so? First, because only God can see the totality of truth. For us, mere mortals who can see only fragments of the truth at any one time, there's an irreducible multiplicity of perspectives. So to just give you an example, this week I had a conversation with somebody, and they said, it doesn't matter what the content, they said, that's the truth. So we end up getting into discussion how that wasn't the truth. It's a truth. It's a part of the truth. But like that statement, which was it was a stereotype, it might have some truth to it, but it's not the truth. We see reality now one way, now another. So that's interesting. Our perspectives change with time. The Torah provides us with a dramatic example in its first 2 chapters, which gives us 2 creation accounts, both true, from different vantage points. The different voices of priest and prophet, Hillel and Shammai, philosopher and mystic, historian and poet, each captures something essential about the spiritual life. Even within a single genre, the sages noted that no 2 prophets prophesied in the same style. Torah is a conversation scored for many voices. And we know in the disagreements, he's actually going to quote this later. Second, so why is argument holy? First, only God can see the totality of truth. Second, because justice presupposes the principle that in Roman law is called odi alteram partem, hear the other side. That is why God wants an Abraham, a Moses, a Jeremiah, a Job to challenge him, sometimes to plead for mercy, or as in the case of Moses at the end of this Parsha, Shmot, to urge him to act swiftly in defense of his people. Both the case for the prosecution and for the defense must be heard if justice is to be done and seen to be done. The pursuit of truth and justice requires the freedom to disagree. So first is from the point of view of truth, that only God has the truth, and from the point of view of justice, that to get a fair justice, you need to hear the other side. Nitziv Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda of Berlin, who lived in the 1800s, dean of the Volozhin Yeshiva in Russia, argued that it was the prohibition of disagreement that was the sin of the builders of Babel. What we need, therefore, is not safe spaces, but rather civility. That is to say, giving a respectful hearing to views with which we disagree. In one of its loveliest passages, the Talmud tells us that the views of the school of Hillel became law over the views of Shammai. Why? Because they were pleasant and did not take offense, and because they taught the views of their opponents, Shammai, as well as their own. Indeed, they taught the views of their opponents before their own. That's so profound. Hillel, when he would come into class, the school of Hillel, when they would come into class, before they would start talking about themselves, they would start talking about, what does Shammai think? Let's understand Shammai. It's interesting in the book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective Families. Stephen Covey talks about how in a family, you want to get out of a cycle of win-lose, almost like a competition. You want to be able to create win-win situations. And the way to create win-win situations is to understand before you try to be understood. You have to understand someone before you try to be understood. Try to see the other person's perspective, whether you disagree, like or not, but just see their perspective. Don't be blinded to it. And once you understand them, and that gives them, I believe, validation, it's almost like a person wants to be validated more than they want to be right. It's not about being right. It's about I validate that you have a thought, that you have an opinion. I respect you for that. That's yours. It's less about being right. It's more about being close. And we become close to somebody by acknowledging them as a human being and validating. And where do we learn this from? From God himself, who chose as his prophets people who were prepared to argue with heaven for the sake of heaven in the name of justice and truth. Right? Why does it say? You should remember this this verse, Bereshit, Genesis, chapter 18, verse 19. God tells Abraham, why is he choosing Abraham? Because he will educate his children to follow the way of Hashem, to do righteousness and justice. When you learn to listen to views different from your own, realizing that they are not threatening, but enlarging, then you have discovered the life-changing idea of argument for the sake of heaven. So the life-changing idea number 13. When you learn to listen to views different from your own, realizing that they are not threatening, but enlarging, then you have discovered the life-changing idea of argument for the sake of heaven. Oh my goodness, it's so brilliant. It's almost like when you read this, it makes you want to go look out for opinions that are different than yours, that you disagree with, because you might actually become enlarged by them. Wow, beautiful. Before we go into the next one, any quick thoughts on this one?
Well, he doesn't loop back to university.
Sorry?
He doesn't loop back to the university life and what's going on campuses, and it is.
Well, I guess it's bigger than universities. You know,
sure it is.
You might see it in universities more because they're like a hub of like intellectualism and everybody's got an opinion. But really, it's a symptom of something that's happening everywhere. It's something that everyone needs to this could be reflected in the news we look at. Are we only looking at the news that we like, or that validates us, that makes us feel good? Or do we look at, so for example, I once saw somebody asked Rabbi Aviner, rabbi in Israel, who is well known for, like, you would text him a question, he would respond, a whole response on text. So they asked him, like, there's so many books on parenting. How do you know what's a good book for parenting? And he said, there's no book on parenting that has the truth. You're going to read and be like, okay, I know what to do. He recommended the following practice. Take 10 books, read, skim, look at all of them, get a feel for all of them. You'll have 10 different, like, kind of approaches. And then when you have 10 different pieces, you can kind of rest assured that you're having, like, you have more of a whole picture because you've seen so many perspectives on it. That's a good way to look at it.
Yep.
I feel too good in my own thoughts, then something's wrong.
Yeah, it applies to political views and many other things. Campuses should be a
safe
free.
space.
There should be freedom to speak. I agree with him 100%.
Yeah. Okay. Let's jump in. Wow. So now we got we're page 71, Parshat Va'era. Free will, use it or lose it. I have a feeling he's going to talk about hardening Pharaoh's heart. So in Parshat Va'era is the parsha when the plagues start. So I think you get 7 out of the 10 plagues, if I'm not mistaken. But they start and they finish in the parshat after. In Parshat Va'era, we read for the first time, not of Pharaoh hardening his heart, but of God doing so. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, said God to Moses, and multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. And so indeed we find in the 6th plague, boils, the 8th, locusts, and the 10th, the firstborn. In each case, the hardening is attributed to God. So there are times that it says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, but there are occasions he described where it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Hence the problem that troubled the sages and later commentaries. If God was the cause and Pharaoh merely his passive vehicle, what was his sin? If God hardened his heart, he had no choice. He had no choice. Therefore, no responsibility. Therefore, no culpability. The commentators give a broad range of answers. 1, Pharaoh's loss of free will during the last 5 plagues was a punishment for his obstinacy, correct me, obstinacy in the first 5, where he acted freely. So it was a punishment. This is roughly the position of Maimonides, who argues that after the first 5 refusals, God closed the door of repentance to Pharaoh. 2, opinion 2, the relevant verb hazak does not mean to harden, but to strengthen. God was not taking away Pharaoh's free will, but to the contrary, preserving it in the face of the overwhelming disasters that were hitting Egypt. So that's like the opposite opinion, where he wasn't, he was giving him free will. 3, God is a partner in all human action, but we only usually attribute an act to God if it seems inexplicable in ordinary human terms. Pharaoh acted freely throughout, but it was only during the last 5 plagues that his behavior was so strange that it was attributed to God. Interesting. Note how reluctant the commentators were to take the text at face value, rightly so, because free will is one of the fundamental beliefs of Judaism. No one wants to say that God took away his free will. Maimonides explains why. If we had no free will, there would be, he says, no point to the commands or prohibitions, since we would behave as if we were predestined to. regardless of what the law is. Nor would there be any justice in reward or punishment, since neither the righteous nor the wrongdoer is free to be other than what they are. There's no free will, there's no justice, and you can't have commands and prohibitions. It's interesting. Maimonides there says, and he says this in the laws of repentance. So the laws of repentance are about you make a mistake that you can change your reality, that you can fix something. So in those laws, he says it's a foundation upon which everything rests, that a person has the choice to direct his life this way or that way. So it's almost, he uses actually a very interesting language. If I recall it correctly, it's lehatot. That basically, you can't always control everything, but you could kind of lean in a certain direction on something. So for example, if you want to knock something over, so if you lean on it, then eventually it might kind of tip. So you could lean in a certain direction to manipulate things there. So the problem is an ancient one, but it's become much more salient in modern times because of the sheer accumulation of challenges to the belief in human freedom. Marx said history is formed by the play of economic forces. Freud argued that we are what we are because of unconscious drives. Neo-Darwinians say that however we rationalize our behavior, we do what we do because people who behaved this way in the past survived to hand on their genes to future generations. Most recently, neuroscientists have shown, using fMRI scans, that in some cases our brain registers a decision up to 7 seconds before we are consciously aware of it. All of this is interesting and important, but contemporary secularists usually fail to see what the ancient sages knew. If we genuinely lack free will, our entire sense of what it is to be human will crumble into dust. There is a glaring contradiction at the heart of our culture. On the one hand, secularists believe that nothing should constrain our freedom to choose to do whatever we want to do or be whatever we want to be, so long as we do not harm others. Their supreme value is autonomous choice. On the other hand, secularists tell us that human freedom does not exist. Why then should we invoke freedom to choose a value if it is, according to science, an illusion? If hard determinism is true, there is no reason to honor liberty or create a free society. To the contrary, we should embrace Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where children are conceived and hatched in laboratories and adults programmed to stay happy by a regime of drugs and pleasure. We should implement the scenario of Anthony Burgess's The Clockwork Orange, in which criminals are reformed by brain surgery or conditioning. If freedom does not exist, why be bothered by the addictive nature of computer games and social media? Why prefer genuine reality to virtual reality? It was Nietzsche who rightly observed that the greater our scientific achievements, the lower our view of the human person. Wow, that is a scary thought. The greater our scientific achievements, the lower our view of the human person. No longer the image of God, we have become mere incarnated algorithms. Wow. So
And
I guess in times of these, we need to hear more and more
Ori,
how we are created in the image of God. Yeah.
and the case in point of both of those is was the fascist regime in Germany in the 30s and 40s, and then the Soviet regime under Stalin. They were both scientifically amazing societies,
Mm-hmm.
very advanced in many ways, and look what they did.
Right. How can you dehumanize people to such an extent? So they did. Hmm. The truth is that the more we understand about the human brain, the better able we are to describe what free action really is. At present, scientists distinguish between the amygdala, the most primitive part of the brain, conditioned to sensitize us to potential danger, the limbic system, sometimes called the social brain, which is responsible for much of our emotional life, and the prefrontal cortex, which is analytical and capable of dispassionately weighing the consequences of alternative choices. Interesting. In the footnote here, he says the amygdala in the limbic system are what the Zohar, the Kabbalistic text of Judaism, and other Jewish mystical texts call the nefesh habehemit, the animal soul within us. Animal soul, not in a negative way, but in the way that it takes care of itself in the world. The tensions between these three form the arena within which personal freedom is won or lost. Patterns of behavior are shaped by neural pathways connecting different parts of the brain, but not all of them are good for us. So, for instance, we might turn to drugs or binge eating or thrill seeking to distract us from some of the unhappy chemicals, fears, and anxieties, for instance, that are also part of the architecture of the brain. The more often we do so, the more myelin gets wrapped around the pathway and the more rapid and instinctive the behavior. So the more often we behave in certain ways, the harder it is to break the habit and create a new and different pathway. To do so requires the acquisition of new habits, acted on consistently for an extended period of time. Current scientific thinking suggests that a minimum of 66 days is needed to form a new habit. Excuse me. So we now have a scientific way of explaining the hardening taking place in Pharaoh's heart. Having established a pattern of response to the first 5 plagues, he would find it progressively more difficult at every level, neuroscientifically, psychologically, and politically, to change. The same is true of every bad habit and political decision. Almost all our structures, mental and social, tend to reinforce previous patterns of behavior. So our freedom diminishes every time we fail to exercise it. That's really interesting. I don't want to necessarily talk about politics, but I was speaking to somebody recently about why would you register with a party? Because as soon as you register with the party, you would feel it immediately. You can't get out of it. Like, you're registered for a party. So you almost have a loyalty to the party, whether or not you agree, like it actually is the right thing in that moment. So he gave me a practical reason, because if you don't register for a party, you can't vote in the primaries for the party. So, but the loss of registering for a party is perhaps you're no longer really deciding that this is the right party. You're just going along because you're this, so therefore you have to hold on to who you are because you've already chosen it, whether or not it's the right thing. If so, then this Parsha in contemporary science tell the same story. Freedom is not a given, nor is it an absolute. We have to work for it. We acquire it slowly in stages, and we can lose it. As Pharaoh lost his, and as drug addicts, workaholics, and people addicted to computer games lose theirs. In one of the most famous opening lines in all literature, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote at the beginning of The Social Contract that man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Well, in fact, the opposite is true. Our early character is determined partly by DNA, the genetic heritage of our parents, partly by our home and upbringing, partly by our friends, and partly by the surrounding culture. We are not born free. We have to work hard to achieve freedom. That takes rituals whose repeated performance creates new neural pathways and new rapid response behavior. It requires a certain calibrated distance from the surrounding culture. We are not to be swept away by social fads and fashions that seem liberating now, but destructive in retrospect. It needs a mental mindset that pauses before any significant action and asks, should I do this? May I do this? What rules of conduct should I bring to bear? It involves an internalized narrative of identity so that we can ask of any course of action, is this who I am and what I stand for? Wow. It requires, it seems, what he's saying, a moral compass. It is no accident that the elements listed in the previous paragraph are all prominent features of Judaism, which turns out to be an ongoing seminar in willpower and impulse control. Now that we are beginning to understand the plasticity of the brain, we know at least a little of the neuroscience that lies behind the ability to overcome bad habits and addictions. Keeping Shabbat, for example, has the power to liberate us and our children from smartphone addiction and all that goes with it. The religion whose first festival, Pesach, celebrates collective freedom, gives us in its rituals the skills we need for personal freedom. Look how profound of an idea that is. Because you might be addicted to smoking. Let's say someone keeps Shabbat. On Shabbat, they don't smoke. On Shabbat, they don't smoke. But the rest of the week, let's say they smoke vigorously. Can you really say this person is a smoker when for 25 hours he doesn't smoke? How can that be? So so you might say, oh, he is a smoker. The rest of the week he goes and smokes. Well, look at the psychological impact of knowing that for 25 hours I don't smoke. So somebody recently told me that this is how he quit smoking. He tried to quit smoking for many years. And then one day, I don't remember how it hit him. He asked himself the question, am I a smoker or am I a person who smokes? And as soon as he realized, I'm not a smoker, I'm a person and I'm smoking, he immediately stopped smoking because he no longer self-identified himself with that. As soon as he self-identified, that's who he was. You smoke. So you corroborate that identity. But when you don't smoke for 25 hours on Shabbat, even if the rest of the week you smoke or whatever you do, you can no longer say that you are a smoker. You can now say you're a person, okay, and you smoke. It's very liberating. Freedom is less a gift than an achievement. Even a pharaoh, the most powerful man in the ancient world, could lose it. Even a nation of slaves could, with the help of God, acquire it. Never take freedom for granted. It needs 100 small acts of self-control daily, which is what halacha, Jewish law, is all about. Freedom is a muscle that needs to be exercised. Use it or lose it. That is a life-transforming idea. Wow, I've never heard it said like that. That freedom is not just something you're free. You're not free right now. You're free if you've worked to achieve it, then you could have moments of freedom. You could be free. So life-changing idea number 14, freedom is an achievement. It is a muscle that needs to be exercised daily. Use it or lose it. And that happens in kind of the interplay between willpower and impulse control when making choices towards reinforcing positive, more transcendent behavior. So it's worth noting the famous teaching of Rav Eliyahu Dessler. He says as follows. He describes that there are many areas you don't have free choice, but there's a range of free choice that you have. And when you encounter a situation, that range becomes activated. And part of that range is above you. It will push you to be your higher self, and some of that will be below you. And some is just where you are. So the free will is within that range. You can choose the lower level choice, or you could choose the higher level choice. And as you choose more of the higher level choice, then what used to be a higher level choice is no longer a choice. It actually becomes your default. And you have a new range of choices. It's a very profound way of looking at it. And it's interesting that he says that it's an achievement because in Ethics of the Fathers, it says, who is a free person who has true freedom? Somebody who engages in Torah. Basically, Torah makes you free. So how does Torah make you free? But I think it has to do with the fact that freedom is something you need to acquire. Self-discipline is something you need to acquire. Willpower, impulse control. But you only have willpower and impulse control if you have a frame of reference that there's a higher behavior than this. If I know that there's higher behaviors, I have a little bit of a struggle. You only have that free will if you have a struggle that between what I am, what I could be, or what I don't want to be. So let's use it or lose it. Okay. Shall we jump in? This is also, you guys should know, Passover is coming up. So right now what we're reading is a preparation for Passover. And this is a beautiful one. I think I've heard of this talk of his. It's called The Story We Tell. Okay. So this is Parshat Bo. This is the Exodus from Egypt, the last plagues, the death of the firstborn, the mitzvah of the new moon, and the Exodus. It remains one of the most counterintuitive passages in all of religious literature. Moses is addressing the Israelites just days before their release. They had been exiles for 210 years. After an initial period of affluence and ease, they have been oppressed, enslaved, and their male children killed in an act of slow genocide. Now, after signs and wonders and a series of plagues that have brought the greatest empire of the ancient world to its knees, they are about to go free. Yet Moses does not talk about freedom, or the land flowing with milk and honey, or the journey they will have to undertake through the desert. Instead, 3 times he turns to the distant future, when the journey is complete and the people, free at last, are in their own land. And what he talks about is not the land itself, or the society, or the society they will have to build, or even the demands and responsibilities of freedom. Instead, he talks about education, specifically about the duty of parents to their children. He speaks about the questions children may ask when the epic events that are about to happen are, at best, a distant memory. He tells the Israelites to do what Jews have done from then to now. Tell your children the story. Do it in the maximally effective way. Reenact the drama of exile, exodus, slavery, and freedom. Get your children to ask questions. Make sure that you tell the story as your own, not as some dry account of history. Say that the way you live and the ceremonies you observe are because of what God did for me, not my ancestors, but me. Make it vivid, make it personal, and make it live. He says this not once, but 3 times. It shall be that when you come to the land which God will give you, as he said, and you observe this ceremony, and your children say to you, what does this service mean to you? You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt, when he struck the Egyptians and spared our homes. On that day you shall tell your child, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And thirdly, in the future, when your child asks you, what is this? You shall tell him, with a mighty hand the Lord brought us out from Egypt, from the land of slavery. Why was this the most important thing he could do in this intense moment of redemption? Because freedom is the work of a nation. Nations need identity. Identity needs memory, and memory is encoded in the stories we tell. Without narrative, there is no memory, and without memory, we have no identity. Wow, that's worth reading again. Without narrative, there is no memory, and without memory, we have no identity. The most powerful link between the generations is the tale of those who came before us, a tale that becomes ours and that we hand on as a sacred heritage to those who will come after us. We are the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and identity begins in the story parents tell their children. So, you know that joke, the famous joke of like, 2 parents tell their child about, about the creation. So one parent, mom says, God created Adam and Eve, and we come from, he's created in the image of God, and da 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 da. He goes to his father, and his father tells him the story of, once there was like this nothing, and a blob, and over billions of years you developed, and it came from animals and apes and monkeys and da da. And then he goes back to his mom, and he's all confused. So the mom says to him, I was talking about my side of the family, and he was talking about his side of the family. So it's all about the story we tell. Not that the two have to contradict, but that's for another story, which Rabbi Sachs has a whole book about science and Judaism, and he calls it the Great Partnership. Okay. The narrative provides the answer to the three fundamental questions every reflective individual must ask at some stage in their lives. Who am I? Why am I here? How then shall I live? Who am I? Why am I here? How then shall I live? There are many answers to these questions, but the Jewish ones are: I am a member of the people whom God rescued from slavery to Egypt. I am here to build a society that honors the freedom of others, not just my own. And I must live in conscious knowledge that freedom is the gift of God, honored by keeping his covenant of law and love. Oh my goodness, that should be on one's wall. Twice in the history of the West, this fact was forgotten or ignored or rebelled against. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there was a determined effort to create a world without identities. This was the project called the Enlightenment. It was a noble dream. To it, we owe many developments whose values beyond question and that we must strive to preserve. However, one aspect of it failed and was bound to fail: the attempt to live without identity. This goes back to 2 parshas ago when he's talking about seeing other viewpoints. We might disagree, let's say, with the philosophical underpinnings of the Enlightenment, but you also have to acknowledge the positive of it and all the progress that has been gained through it. The argument went like this: identity throughout the Middle Ages was based on religion, but religion had for centuries led to war between Christians and Muslims. Then, following the Reformation, it led to war between Christians, Protestants, and Catholics. Therefore, to abolish war, one had to move beyond identity. Identities are particular. Therefore, let us worship only the things that are universal: reason and observation, philosophy and science. Let us have systems, not stories. Then we will become one humanity, like the world before Babel. As Schiller put it, and Beethoven set to music in the last movement of the Ninth Symphony, alle Menschen werden Brüder, all men will be brothers. It cannot be done, at least as humanity is presently constituted. The reaction when it came was fierce and disastrous. The 19th century saw the return of the repressed. Identity came back with a vengeance, this time based not on religion, but on one of three substitutes for it: the nation state, the Aryan race, and the working class. In the 20th century, the nation state led to 2 world wars. Race led to the Holocaust. The class struggle led to Stalin, the Gulag, and the KGB. 100 million people were killed in the name of 3 false gods: nation state, race, and class. For the past 50 years, the West have been engaged in a second attempt to abolish identity, this time in the opposite direction. What the secular West now worships is not the universal, but the individual, the self, the me, the I. Morality, the thick code of shared values binding society together for the sake of the common good, has been dissolved into the right of each individual to do or be anything he or she chooses, so long as they do not directly harm others. And that's very fascinating because Rabbi Sacks's second last book of his life, which came out about a month before this book, is all about that theme: morality. Identities have become mere masks we wear temporarily and without commitment. Wow. That kind of means like we're pretending, we're wearing masks, literally and figuratively. For large sections of society, marriage is an anachronism, parenthood delayed or declined, and community a faceless crowd. We still have stories from Harry Potter to Lord of the Rings to Star Wars, but they are films, fictions, fantasies, a mode of not of engagement, but of escapism. Wow. Such a world is supremely tolerant until it meets views not to its liking, when it quickly becomes brutishly intolerant and eventually degenerates into the politics of the mob. This is populism, the prelude to tyranny. Today's hyper-individualism will not last. We are social animals. We cannot live without identities, families, communities, and collective responsibility. A friend of mine in the community, he says, we have the Statue of Liberty on one coast, but on the other coast of America, we need what's called the Statue of Responsibility. Liberty is about the individual. Responsibility is about the collective. We can't have one without the other. So we're social animals. We cannot live without identities, families, communities, and collective responsibility, which means we cannot live without the stories that connect us to the past, a future, and a large group whose history and destiny we share. The biblical insight still stands. To create and sustain a free society, you have to teach your children the story of how we achieve freedom and what its absence tastes like, the unleavened bread of affliction and the bitter herbs of slavery. Lose the story, and eventually you lose your freedom. Wow. Lose the story, and eventually you lose your freedom. You lose your identity. That is what happens when you forget who you are and why. You have nothing to fight for. The greatest gift we can give our children is not money or possessions, but a story, a real story, not a fantasy, one that connects them to us and to a rich heritage of high ideals. We're not particles of dust blown this way or that by the passing winds of fad and fashion. We are heirs to a story that inspired 100 generations of our ancestors and eventually transformed the Western world. What you forget, you lose. The West is forgetting its story. We must never forget ours. With the hindsight of 33 centuries, we can see how right Moses was. A story told across the generations is the gift of an identity. And when you know who you are and why, you can navigate the wilderness of time with courage and confidence. That is a life-changing idea. Unbelievable, Rabbi Sachs. So life-changing idea number 15, know your own story, because a story told across the generations is a gift. When you know who you are and why, you can navigate the wilderness of time with courage and confidence. Wow, beautiful. And what a story we have. We have such an unbelievable um, heritage, and we really stand on the shoulders of giants. So when we actually stand on their shoulders, we are um, we are better for it. So let's share one last thing about this week's Parsha. 1 second, sorry. Okay, so children, let's see. This is about tomorrow. We mentioned is a fast day. Okay. So this is from Sivan Rachav Meir. Tomorrow is the fast of the 10th of Tevet, the day we say a general Kaddish for all Holocaust victims whose date of death is unknown. So that's fascinating. So the fast day tomorrow is also designated as the day we say Kaddish for people, especially Holocaust victims, but I think all Jews who we do not know their day of passing, or we don't even know them. This week, I heard two stories about the generation born after the Holocaust. Yosef Rakover was a doctor to the partisans who fought in the Lipchan forest of Belarus during World War II. While in his hideout, he heard the Nazis had entered the area and were killing every Jew they found. Rather than be murdered, Rakover, together with his wife and son, injected themselves with heavy doses of morphine and passed out. His wife and son died of an overdose, while Rakover was rendered unconscious and thrown onto a pile of corpses. The partisans found and miraculously resuscitated him. Rakover then continued to treat and perform surgery on the partisan forces. He met Sonia, a nurse who had also lost her spouse and son during the war. Rakover and Sonia survived, married, and came on Aliyah, moved to Israel. One of their daughters is Professor Galia Rachav, head of the Department of Infectious Diseases at Tel Ashima Hospital. She participated in the torch lighting ceremony during Independence Day this past year in honor of the medical teams fighting the coronavirus. It's probably a relative of her because this is Sivan Rachav Meir, same name. In the Jewish community of story too, in the Jewish community of Thessaloniki, Greece, there were 60,000 Jews before World War II. More than 50,000 of them were murdered by the Nazis. I think a lot of people don't know that the Jews of Greece were massacred as well. The Burla family was among those that survived, and after the war, a son, Avraham, was born. He grew up, became a doctor, and moved from Greece to the United States. Today, Avram Albert is the CEO of Pfizer, the first drug company to develop a vaccine against the coronavirus. The children of Holocaust survivors, and by extension, all of us, have inherited a mission to save lives, to bring blessing to the world, to rehabilitate, to heal. It's something to think about on the day of the General Kaddish for Holocaust victims. So with that, everybody, we'll wish you a Shabbat Shalom. However, you will commemorate the fast tomorrow. It's just good to take a few moments to reflect what the day is about. You could research that a little bit, but also just to reflect on all the people who've lost their lives and who have given things for us to be where we are. And we have no concept and knowledge of who they are. People who have died, who've given up their lives in our history, recent and distant. And just to give them a moment and just honor and say, I don't forget you. I'm not without gratitude. And just send that out. And Hashem knows who they are. And he could deliver that message to anybody. But just give that to them. Let them know that they're not forgotten. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone.